There is a memo in the National Security Archive with a subject line that reads like the setup to a joke. 3 words survive the redaction: views on trained cats. It is dated March 1967. It carries the markings of the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, and it is not a joke. It is the after-action report on the several years the United States government spent trying to turn a living cat into a spy. The program was real, the document is real, and the most human thing in the whole file is the way it ends, with the agency calling the work a remarkable scientific achievement, praising its own people as models for scientific pioneers, and then concluding, in the flat language of a closing memo, that the whole idea would not be practical. This is the story the paper trail actually supports, and it is the story of where the paper trail stops and the legend takes over. The cover name that history remembers is Acoustic Kitty. The concept came out of the same corner of the CIA that built the U-2 cameras and the early reconnaissance satellites. The engineers in internal history would later call the Wizards of Langley. Their problem in the 1960s was an old one. How do you put a microphone in a room you are not allowed to enter? People get searched, briefcases get searched, rooms get swept, but almost nobody in any country stops to frisk a cat. According to the account later given by the men who designed the systems, the target that made a cat attractive was a foreign official whose long meetings were a kind of open house for animals. House cats wandered in and out of the room while he talked. A cat near that conversation would not look like surveillance. It would look like furniture with a tail. So the technical service set out to build one. What the surgery involved has been reconstructed most carefully by the science writer Emily Anthis. In an operation that ran about an hour, a veterinarian implanted a microphone in the cat's ear canal. A small radio transmitter went at the base of the skull. A thin wire antenna was threaded down through the fur toward the tail, so the animal itself became the aerial. The cat would hear a conversation, and the conversation would travel out of the cat and into a waiting receiver. It is a genuinely strange image, and it is worth being precise about it, because precision is the whole point of a file like this. The agency was not being whimsical. It was applying serious money and serious engineering to a hard surveillance problem, and it got far enough to put a working transmitter inside a live animal and watch it walk. That is where the documented record and the famous story begin to part company, and I want to be careful about the seam between them. Here's what the declassified memo supports. By 1967, the team had satisfied itself that, in the document's own words, cats can indeed be trained to move short distances. They saw no reason the technique could not be extended further. The science worked on its own narrow terms, but then comes the sentence that closes the program. The environmental and security factors in using this technique in a real foreign situation, the memo says, forced the conclusion that it would not be practical. Read plainly, that is a bureaucracy admitting that a cat in a laboratory and a cat in the field are 2 different animals. One follows training, the other follows whatever it wants. The memo praises the team, thanks them, and shuts the project down. That is the end of the part we can prove. Now the legend. The most quoted version of how Acoustic Kitty ended comes from a single man, Victor Marchetti, a former CIA officer who left the agency and spoke about the program for a BBC documentary in 1995. In Marchetti's telling, the cat's first real assignment was to eavesdrop on 2 men on a park bench outside the Soviet embassy in Washington. The team drove up in a van, opened the door, and put the cat out toward the target. And a taxi, he says, came down the street and ran the animal over almost immediately. In his words, there they were, sitting in the van with all those dials, and the cat was dead. It is a perfect story. It is funny. It is bleak. It has a punchline. It is the version you have probably heard, and it is the version printed in most retellings, including the figure that usually travels with it, an estimated cost of somewhere around $20 million. I want to flag that number carefully. That figure is also Marchetti's estimate. It is not a budget line in any declassified document. Some accounts in the press have put it closer to $15 million. The honest statement is that no released file gives us the price, and the numbers we repeat all trace back to former officers reconstructing it from memory. So one name source says the cat died under a taxi on its first mission, at a cost of roughly $20 million. That is account A. Account B comes from a man with at least as much standing to know. Robert Wallace ran the CIA's Office of Technical Service, the very directorate that builds devices like this, and he is a co-author of A History of Agency Spy Technology. In 2013, Wallace flatly rejected the taxi story. The acoustic kitty, he said, was not killed by a taxicab. In his account, the project was abandoned for a far less cinematic reason. Cats, it turns out, will not reliably go where you point them. The training never held. And rather than a dead animal in a gutter, Wallace describes a quieter ending. The equipment was removed, the cat was sewn back up, and it went on to live, in his words, a long and happy life. 2 former CIA officers, 2 endings. One says the program died with the cat, the other says the cat outlived the program. And the declassified memo, the only thing here that is not a memory, takes neither side. It does not mention a taxi, it does not mention the Soviet embassy. It says the science worked and the field application did not. And it stops. This is the part of the file that I find more interesting than any taxi, because the thing the document settles is not how the cat died. It is why a project this strange could run for years inside a serious intelligence agency in the first place. The answer the memo gives, between the lines, is that it was never really about the cat. It was about the principle. If you could prove that a living animal could carry a working microphone into a guarded space, you had opened a door. And the door mattered more than the cat that walked through it. The wizards of Langley were not trying to win one conversation outside the Soviet embassy. They were testing whether biology could be turned into hardware. And on that question, the memo's verdict is almost wistful. The achievement is real. The deployment is impossible. Thank you, and goodbye. It would be easy to file Acoustic Kitty under Cold War absurdity and move on, and most people do. But that is the wrong drawer. The right drawer is the one marked with everything we still do not have. Remember that this single redacted memo is the only document the CIA has ever released by name on its animal surveillance work. One page, heavily blacked out, recovered through a Freedom of Information request by an archivist named Jeffrey Richelson, who pried it loose in 2001 alongside the rest of the science and technology files. Everything else, the operational records, the budgets, the other animals that almost certainly followed, remains classified or destroyed. So what we are really looking at is a keyhole. Through it, we can see one closed project, one strange success that was also a failure, and the careful, deniable language of an institution writing down just enough to close a file and no more. The cat is the part everyone laughs at. The redactions are the part worth taking seriously. We can prove the program existed. We can prove the surgery happened and the verdict came down. We cannot prove how it ended, because the 2 men who told us were telling us 2 different things, and the only neutral witness in the room was a piece of paper that chose not to say. That gap between what the document confirms and what the storytellers filled in is the entire discipline of reading these files. The taxi makes a better ending. The memo is the true one. And the memo's last word on the strangest surveillance program of the decade is not death or success or $20 million. It is a single bureaucratic shrug, not practical. If you want to read the file yourself, it is linked below exactly where I found it. The next one is already open on the table.